A 12-year-old Apache boy stands in a clearing with a cavalry sword in his hands. The blade is almost as tall as he is. Across from him, a white soldier with rope burns on his wrists, watches the boy's grip, and shakes his head. Wrong. Hold it lower. The weight needs to sit in your backhand, not your front. The boy adjusts. He swings. The blade cuts air and nothing else. 20 feet away, sitting on a flat rock with her arms crossed, the boy's mother watches every movement. Her eyes carry something heavier than grief. They carry purpose. She asked the soldier to do this, not as a kindness, as a punishment, but to understand how a captured cavalry soldier ended up training the son of the woman whose village he helped destroy. You need to go back 4 months, to a morning that smelled like smoke and blood on the banks of the Gila River. The raid happened at dawn. Lieutenant James Holt and 40 men from the 3rd Cavalry rode into the Apache settlement before the cooking fires were lit. Their orders were clear: neutralize the hostile encampment, destroy food stores, disperse the inhabitants. Now, in the language of the 1860s, U.S. military, neutralize could mean almost anything. And on that particular morning, it meant everything. The soldiers burned the wickiups. They slaughtered the horses. They scattered the grain stores into the river. And when warriors tried to defend their families, the cavalry cut them down. Holt watched a sergeant drag an old man from a shelter and strike him with the butt of a rifle. He watched another soldier set fire to a wickiup without checking if anyone was still inside. He heard a child screaming from within the flames. He did nothing. That's the part that would haunt him. Not what he did, what he didn't do. By the time the sun was fully up, the village was ash. 11 Apache warriors were dead. Among them was a man named Goyatle, a respected fighter and husband to a woman named Casa. Their 12-year-old son, Nayol, had been out hunting when the attack happened. He returned to find his home destroyed and his father's body lying in the blackened ruins of their wickiup. The cavalry rode away believing the job was finished. But Apache memory is longer than any soldier's march, and Apache justice operates on a timeline that white men rarely understand. 3 weeks later, Holt was riding alone between outposts when his horse stepped into a concealed pit trap. The animal's leg snapped. Holt was thrown and landed hard against a boulder. Before he could reach his rifle, 4 Apache warriors appeared from the rocks around him like shadows taking human form. Now, here's something about Apache guerrilla tactics that the U.S. Army spent decades trying to understand. Apache warriors could move through the harshest terrain in near total silence. Their training from childhood emphasized stealth over strength. Boys practiced moving through dense brush without breaking a single twig. They could cross rocky ground without leaving visible tracks. General George Crook, one of the most experienced frontier commanders in American history, eventually had to recruit Apache scouts to fight Apache warriors because his own soldiers simply could not match their fieldcraft. Holt never heard them coming. He woke up with his wrists bound, being dragged through a canyon on a travois behind an Apache horse. They brought him to Casa. She stood outside a temporary camp in the foothills of the Mogollon Mountains. Her face showed nothing, not anger, not grief, something colder, calculation. The warriors threw Holt at her feet. He expected to die. In that moment, he almost wanted to. The guilt of what he had participated in sat in his chest like a stone he couldn't cough up. But Casa didn't kill him. She studied him for a long time. Then she spoke in broken but clear Spanish. You destroyed my home. You helped kill my husband. Holt said nothing. There was nothing to say. Now you will give me something in return. She pointed to Niol, who stood behind her with his dead father's knife on his belt and rage in his eyes. You will teach my son to fight. You will teach him everything your soldiers know, every tactic, every weapon, every weakness. And when he is ready, he will use what you taught him to make sure no cavalry raid ever destroys another village. Holt stared at her. You want me to train him to kill soldiers? Case's expression didn't change. I want you to train him to protect his people. If soldiers die in the process, that is their choice, not his. It was the most precise act of revenge Holt had ever encountered. Not a knife to the throat, something slower. She wanted him to build a weapon that could one day be turned against everything he represented. And she wanted him to know it every single day. The first month was brutal. Niol hated Holt with an intensity that made the desert heat feel mild. The boy refused to eat near him, refused to look at him, refused to acknowledge his instructions. When Holt demonstrated a cavalry sword drill, Niol deliberately swung at his head. You're going to hurt yourself, Holt said. Good, the boy replied. Then I will know what my father felt. Holt understood. He didn't push. He simply showed up every morning, laid out the training drills, and waited. Some days Niall participated. Some days he sat on a rock and stared at Holt with his father's knife in his lap. But slowly, painfully, something shifted. It started with a question. Niall watched Holt clean a rifle one evening and asked, "How far can it kill?" Holt looked at the boy. "Depends on the rifle. This one, maybe 300 yards if the wind is calm." Niall frowned. "My father's bow could reach maybe 100 yards. Holt nodded. "That's why rifles changed everything on the frontier. Not because soldiers are braver, because the weapon keeps you further from the thing you're killing, makes it easier to pretend it's not a person." The boy went quiet. Then he said, "Teach me the rifle." That was the turning point. Not a dramatic moment. Just a boy choosing knowledge over hatred, even if the hatred was still there underneath. Now, here's where the training becomes something extraordinary, because Niall wasn't just learning cavalry tactics. He was filtering them through an Apache mind. The first technique they developed together was what Holt called the ghost approach. Cavalry soldiers were trained to charge in formation, thundering across open ground. Niall combined this with the Apache tradition of silent movement. He practiced riding at full gallop, then dismounting in motion and continuing on foot without making a sound. The transition from horseback speed to ground-level stealth was seamless. A defender would hear hooves approaching, prepare for a mounted charge, and then hear nothing. By the time they realized the rider had dismounted, Niall would already be behind them. The second technique was the echo feint. Cavalry used bugles and shouts to coordinate attacks. Niall learned to mimic these sounds from different positions in a canyon, making a single fighter sound like an approaching column. In Apache tradition, warriors already used the terrain to amplify and redirect sound. Niall merged the two, creating a confusion tactic that could make 10 fighters sound like 50. The third was the most dangerous. Niall called it the wound you choose. In cavalry training, soldiers aim for center mass, the largest target. In Apache knife combat, fighters aim for tendons, arteries, and joints with short, precise strikes designed to disable instantly rather than kill slowly. Niall trained to fight with both systems simultaneously. At range, he used the rifle like a soldier. At close quarters, he switched to Apache blade work. The combination was something neither tradition had seen before. But here's what neither Holt nor Casa expected. As months passed, the hatred in Niall's eyes began changing shape. Not disappearing. Transforming. He stopped seeing Holt as the enemy who destroyed his village. He started seeing him as a man carrying the same kind of wound Niall carried, except Holt's wound was guilt. And guilt, Niall was learning, can hurt worse than grief. One evening after training, Niall sat beside the fire and said something that stopped Holt cold. "My mother wants me to become a weapon against your people." Holt didn't respond, but my father was not a weapon. The boy stared at the flames. He was a protector. There is a difference. "What's the difference?" Holt asked quietly. "A weapon doesn't choose who it hurts. A protector does." In Apache warrior culture, this distinction was deeply real. The concept of D, spiritual power, was central to everything. Warriors sought visions before battle. They received guidance from animal spirits, from the land itself. The power wasn't about destruction. It was about protection. A warrior's purpose was to shield the people, not to seek violence for its own sake. The greatest Apache leaders, men like Cochise and Victorio, were remembered not for how many enemies they killed, but for how many of their own people they kept alive. Niall was reaching for that understanding on his own, and it terrified his mother. If you're the kind of person who watches stories like this all the way through, hit subscribe, because what happens next changes everything for all three of them. Casa confronted Holt after overhearing her son's words. She stood in the darkness outside his shelter, her voice barely above a whisper but sharp as a blade edge. "You are softening him. I'm teaching him what you asked me to teach. I asked you to make him strong. He is strong." Holt met her eyes. "Stronger than you realize. Strong enough to choose who he fights and why. That's not weakness, Casa. That's the thing that separates a warrior from a murderer." The word hung between them. Murderer. Holt wasn't just talking about Niall. Casa's jaw tightened. "You do not get to lecture me about murder. You, who rode into my home and watched it burn." "You're right," Holt said. "I don't. But your son does." 8 months into the training, The test came without warning. A rider arrived at the camp with urgent news. A cavalry patrol, 20 soldiers, was moving through the valley toward a small Apache settlement 3 miles south. Women, children, elderly, the warriors were away hunting. The settlement was undefended. Casa looked at her son. This is why I had you trained. Niall looked at Holt. Then he looked at the knife on his belt. His father's knife. Holt said nothing. This was not his moment. The boy mounted his horse and rode toward the valley. Holt followed at a distance, not as a commander, but as a witness. What happened next would be told and retold across Apache camps for years. Niall reached the valley before the patrol. He used the ghost approach to position himself on a ridge overlooking the only path the cavalry could take. Then he used the echo feint, mimicking bugle calls, and shouted orders from 3 different positions in the canyon walls. The patrol commander halted. He heard what sounded like a full company of soldiers ahead and on both flanks. Confused, he sent 2 scouts forward. Niall let them pass, then fired a single rifle shot into the canyon wall above the patrol. The ricochet sent rock fragments showering down on the soldiers. The horses panicked. The patrol commander, now convinced he was riding into an ambush by a superior force, ordered a retreat. 20 armed soldiers turned their horses around and rode back the way they came. A 12-year-old boy had turned them away without drawing blood. The settlement was safe, but Niall didn't celebrate. He sat on the ridge as the dust settled and stared at the retreating cavalry. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from the realization of what he could have done and chose not to. When Holt reached the ridge, the boy looked up at him. I could have killed them. I know. My mother would have wanted me to. I know that too. Niall held his father's knife in both hands. My father protected this land for 30 years. He never killed when he could turn enemies away instead. He said the land doesn't need blood. It needs people willing to stand on it. The boy slid the knife back into his belt. I want to be like him, not like you, not like the soldiers, like him. Holt felt something crack open in his chest. For the first time in months, the stone of guilt shifted, not because he was forgiven, but because the boy had done something with Holt's teaching that Holt himself had never managed. He had stood at the edge of violence and walked away. When they returned to camp, Casa was waiting. She had heard what happened from a scout. Her son had saved the settlement, without killing. She looked at Niall for a long time. Then she looked at Holt. For months, she had wanted Holt to forge her son into a blade aimed at the cavalry. Instead, he had helped forge something more dangerous than a weapon, a protector who understood both worlds. The next morning, the camp woke to find Holt's shelter empty. His ropes were cut. His horse was still tied to the post. He had left on foot, walking south toward the military outpost. On the ground where he'd slept, he had left his rifle. Beside it, scratched into the dirt with a stick, were 4 words in Spanish. He is ready. Forgive me. Casa stood over the message for a long time. The wind blew dust across the words, slowly erasing them. She didn't chase him. She didn't send warriors. She picked up the rifle, carried it to her son, and placed it in his hands. Your teacher is gone, she said. Niall looked at the rifle, then toward the south, where the dust of Holt's footprints was already fading. He was not my teacher, the boy said quietly. He was my father's last lesson. In the years that followed, Niall became one of the most respected protectors in the Mogollon Mountains. He never sought violence. He used the hybrid tactics he developed to defend settlements through misdirection, terrain control, and the kind of strategic thinking that combined the best of 2 worlds that were supposed to be enemies. And somewhere on the frontier, a former lieutenant named James Holt walked away from the only army he'd ever known. Not because he'd been captured, not because he'd been broken, because a 12-year-old boy had shown him what courage actually looked like. And it looked nothing like a cavalry charge. Sometimes the strongest warriors are the ones who learn to put the blade down. And sometimes the people we're ordered to destroy are the same ones who teach us what it means to be human. If you want to hear the true story of the soldiers who walked away from the U.S. Army to live among the Apache and why the military tried to erase them from history, that story is on screen now.